On Halloween 2024, Deltarune turned 6, and Toby announced the release of Chapters 3 and 4 for 2025. Finally, we'll get to pick up on the striking cliffhanger at the end of Chapter 2. Finally, we may learn if Chris is the Roaring Knight or just a convenient red herring, what the deal is with Des, who Mike really is, and so much more. We've had over 2 years to sit and ponder what the future holds for this game, with the spammed in sweepstakes, progress updates, and newsletters giving us slivers to fuel our speculation. So I'm going to do just that. Using the scraps of information and teasers in conjunction with the first 2 chapters, I'd like to share my final thoughts and theories before the next big update, assuming that we don't get a newsletter in December that requires me to make a follow-up video. But for now, let's get started. Perhaps the best place to start is to consider all the large plot points set up in the first 2 chapters. Easily one of the earliest examples is Gerson Boom. From the moment we leave Chris's room, we're introduced to his writing in the Dreemurr house. At this point, we don't have the full context, but when you explore the abandoned classroom after sealing the Dark Fountain, you see a childish drawing of a turtle that not only works as a funny SpongeBob reference, but also as a drawing Alvin made of his father. This is further confirmed in the anniversary livestream from a few years back.
Bold and brash.
Threw me off.
Just kidding.
Wow, I was going to be so excited to break the news that Squidward
That's
was in
Alvin's
the game.
drawing of his dad, Gerson.
Gerson's overall fate still isn't established yet, until you reach the graveyard, where not only are monsters from Undertale's amalgams buried, but also Gerson himself. From this we learn that he's a historian, an author, and a beloved father. He even has a bench dedicated to him, with a curious quote discussing dreams and their inspiration in his work. It's interesting because Dark Worlds are compared to dreams multiple times in both chapters, and Toby was inspired by a dream to even create this game. So it's possible that Gerson at one point experienced a similar adventure and used that to influence his Lord of the Hammer series. In Chapter 2, Alvin offers further insight to how beloved he was in the community, not only as a writer, but as a teacher Alphys coincidentally replaced, in a similar fashion to how she replaced Gaster in Undertale. I doubt the parallel is coincidental. Both Gerson and Gaster are set up as mysterious ghosts of their game's respective narratives, with the key difference being that Gerson is front and center, whereas Gaster's lore is entirely missable outside of data mining due to the RNG element of the fun events. Granted, Gaster's relevance grows much more apparent in Deltarune proper, between the Twitter takeovers, the Goner Maker, the Garbage Noise, and the old version of him.png on the Deltarune website, back before the game had even released. But even within the context of Undertale, Gerson holds great significance to that game's backstory and lore, on top of being one of the few characters to directly comment on and also use game mechanics in a clever way, as seen in his No Mercy dialogue, where he outright admits that the shop interface is the only thing keeping him alive. We also learn a bit more about Gerson's history, from his humble beginnings as a blacksmith to a historian. As it turns out, his Lord of the Hammer series began as stories he'd tell his children, which in turn grew into the successful book series beloved throughout the world. The real question with Gerson is whether he remains as a character manifested in the memories and stories people tell about him, or whether or not he will still be there in some twist, be that he never died and is actually in the Dark World, his remains reviving as a Darkner, or something else entirely. But I do think it is extremely likely that Gerson's family will take on a larger role the more that the story progresses. Berdley already mentioned Miss Boom, another one of Gerson's children, and Alvin has gone from being a mere town priest to a character with deeply insightful dialogue and an air of mystery, the way he laments Gerson's hammer being buried and questions if his father would be proud of him. If Gerson didn't die, then perhaps his hammer was buried under the assumption that he did. This could also explain Alvin's hesitation if Gerson, like Des, simply went missing and was presumed dead. I'm skeptical, if only because we don't have a lot to suggest he's alive beyond one specific read of Alvin's dialogue. Still, of the non-central characters speculated to be the Roaring Knight, Alvin is one of the more popular choices despite his lack of unique dialogue sound and portrait. While some have dismissed him as being too minor or uninteresting, I think him being so central to the town's religion places him in a great position for a big narrative twist. After all, Ralsei's prophecy discusses banishing the angel's heaven, and Hometown's local religion focuses on the angel as a symbol and being of great worship. Angelic imagery appears multiple times, including the dolls that the Dreemurrs and Holidays made, displayed in Rudy's hospital room, and the multiple times Noelle herself gets referred to as an angel. We only ever see Alvin with his eyes closed. I can easily see a dramatic shift in his character occurring when he opens his eyes, as Deltarune already does a lot with eye symbolism, from the eye-shaped markings in the first Dark World area to the significance of Susie's eyes appearing at the end of Chapter 1, Chris's eyes being shadowed by their bangs and thus unseen, and even the way Noelle's hair obscures her eyes after casting Snowgrave. Not to mention, the Titans themselves incorporate the same eerie eye imagery first foreshadowed at the start of the game, where it was stated that only eyes blinded by darkness can see. So while it could be that Alvin's closed eyes are purely for the aesthetic, I think there's still room for something more. His name is absent from the Goner Maker, which is especially striking when both Caddy with an I and Y, Cusey, Jockington, Broody, and even Papyrus are present. If Alvin is meant to appear unassuming, would it not make sense to exclude him? To make people believe he is nothing more than a minor NPC. Even the lack of a unique dialogue sound doesn't rule out his importance, given that Rule's card is also missing one. And we know from the recent newsletters that Rules is set to appear in future chapters as a recurring character. All this to say, I don't think we can discount a larger role for him, whether it's as the Roaring Knight, a larger role in a church-themed Dark World, or something else entirely related to Gerson's legacy. Like with Gerson's legacy, Chapter 1 establishes another one of Deltarune's key plot threads through the Dreemurr and Holiday families. Right after the Goner Maker, we're shown a few key details. 1. Our human protagonist, Chris, lives with their mother, Toriel. 2. They share a room with Asriel. Asriel's side of the room is vivid and full of exquisite character details, from the trophies on the shelf to the video games under his bed, including an off-brand controller that he used so that Chris could use the real one. He has religious ska music, and in Chapter 2 we learn that he was working on a video game that he never finished with a sneaky reference to Undertale. We also learn that he was the one who checked out the How to Draw Dragons book that remains long overdue. The contrast between Chris and Asriel immediately sticks out in how barren and desaturated Chris's side of the room is, with nothing but a birdcage and a wagon and a stain on the floor to call their own. This already sets up Chris as someone who is decidedly unhappy or otherwise unwell before we start to realize just how much of a character they are later on. But other small details further set up the framework of the family dynamic, like how the picture on the fridge only features Toriel, Asriel, and Chris, or the floral scent in the garbage can serving as one of the only connections to Asgore until after sealing the Dark Fountain. He simply doesn't come up, even when Toriel discusses Asriel returning from college the coming week. The unplugged TV is a seemingly inconspicuous detail at first until you realize it's plugged in Chapter 2, and the Book of Hymns connects the family to the local religion, which was later given great significance when Alvin discusses the family's church-going days. Whether it's Asriel's role in the choir, his confessions on Chris's behalf because of dropping Yoshi in a pit, or Chris trying to get sick juice, or Toriel making Asriel go to church after playing Truth or Dare with Bratty and kissing her. Something that's striking is how, despite Chris being a teenager, Toriel still holds their hand when walking them to the school building. This could simply be Toriel's doting nature, or it could showcase a certain fragility. Chris and Toriel in general have an interesting relationship, where Toriel is deeply caring and concerned, yet there's this unspoken distance at play too. I touch on this a bit more on my video about the Dreemurr parents. What sticks out to me is how hands-off Toriel is. She'll scold Chris for flushing the toilet excessively, gets grumpy when they eat the entire pie, and locks her room to protect the chocolate she buys, yet she also lets Chris get away with a lot. She confides in Alphys that she's worried about Chris, but also tells Susie that Chris going into the bathroom for extended periods of time with the sink running is normal for them, with this air of resignation. We know that Chris has difficulties fitting in with monster society, the way they wore that horned headband as a child, and their internet searches include how to do magic. They and Caddy, with an I, shared an interest in the occult as well, which could very well be a tease to the situation that led to us controlling their body. But I think the otherness of Chris's humanity may contribute to Toriel's uncertainty with how to handle them. Genuine mental health and social issues may be brushed off as human quirks, especially when Chris already has a history of morbidly pranking Noelle and just being an odd little gremlin. And I think the fact that Toriel and Asgore simply don't talk much hardly helps. Cusey mentions how the family used to go together to her diner, but after the divorce, it was just Chris and Asriel, and now Asriel is gone. Asriel was this anchor for Chris, someone who would even carry them to school when they were younger. Those childhood days of exploring with Asriel, Noelle, and Des are built up in Chapter 2 as cherished memories of a time gone by, building off of Rudy's words in Chapter 1 about how close their families used to be. I think many of us agree that the disappearance of Des and Asgore's removal from the police force are key plot hooks designed to grab audience attention. Many have speculated that the town bunker is involved as well, especially due to Chris's fears regarding the place and the slowed-down, mused smile used in the room, also tying it to Gas from the Dark Worlds. The Spamton sweepstakes also alludes to this in the Chris Dreemurr Chris page, with the way Chris would visit Noelle's house to play piano as a form of expression, or even musical venting that they'd immediately stop once they realized they were being watched. There's this air of distance that pervades both families, and the remaining members of their friend group. Noelle is still cordial toward Chris, and clearly still cares, with the way she offers to include them in the group project before Birdley shuts her down. She takes note of Susie's bullying, even if she doesn't act on her observations, and she's surprised when Chris approaches her at the end of Chapter 1. So seemingly talkative and friendly after all this time. What strikes me, too, is the way that many members of both families have one foot firmly stuck in the past. We see it with Asgore keeping his wedding bouquet alive, preserved in glass containers with the wedding photo on the fridge. Rudy reminisces a lot about his college days, and we see how Asgore regularly brings him flowers. Yet there's also this air of distance. Mayor Holiday remains an unseen presence, holed away in her office, but described as cold and intimidating, hard on Noelle, and strict, whereas Rudy is laid back and fun-loving. Asgore has to confront Toriel at the convenience store to even hold a conversation with her. While he butts in on the conversation he wasn't part of, and later tries to get love advice from Sans, the subject of what to do about Azrael still warrants a discussion as a family, a discussion they've yet to have. Asgore chases a love lost, while Toriel avoids the issue, just as she avoids really confronting Chris's personal problems. In contrast, Asgore tries really hard to accommodate for Chris with the big hugs and promises to spend time with his kids, even inviting Chris to stay with him until he realizes it wouldn't work out. He's behind on rent because he's too generous with his flowers, and only eats the free pickles he gets from Sans. While we've yet to see Mayor Holiday, I get the feeling that she's buried herself in her work in order to cope with the situation, growing even colder as the years went by. Then again, with the way Des promised to take Noelle somewhere far away from hometown, I can't help but wonder if perhaps the seeds were already there. Perhaps Des and her mother had existing friction even before the disappearance that only made Mayor Holiday double down, growing more extreme. The two families are hanging by a thread, and while the normal route in Chapter 2 helped Noelle process some of her feelings regarding her mother through Queen, Rudy's fate as well as her mother's continued on-screen absence bode ominous for the future. And then there's Azrael, the golden child, beloved by everyone who knows him. Pizza Pants, Bratty, Caddy with a Y, and Alvin all speak so highly of him, casting a long shadow upon Chris. All signs point to pre-college Azrael being exceptionally kind, playing with the off-brand controller whenever he and Chris gamed, chatting with Chris whenever he could until the internet went down, and all those times they'd go to QC's, drawing shapes on the misty windows and drinking hot cocoa. Hot cocoa that leaves Chris choked up when they drink it in Chapter 1, reminded of the memories of time long past. Yet what sticks out to me is the absence. At some point or another, it seems Azrael stopped making contact. Chris also searched up college vacations. They refuse to look in Azrael's room in the mansion, though Susie's dialogue suggests that whatever is in there is revealing in some way or form, and not necessarily in a flattering light. With Chapter 3 focusing on the Dreemurr house, I think we're finally going to get some proper insight into the family dynamics, both past and present. While most of the preview images seem tailored more towards wacky television antics, let's not forget that Darkners remember. The TV was unplugged for a while. If I had to guess, it's at least been that way since Azrael left for college and Chris no longer had anyone to play games with. I suspect Tenna has a goldmine of memories of better times, which you may try to use as a way to appease Chris, especially since Chris opened this dark world. This may lead to a certain level of reverence towards them not seen in prior chapters. I can see Toriel factoring into this as well, as the mother with a caring yet strained relationship with her child. On one hand, I can see Tenna feeling resentful for being left to collect dust as the family splintered apart, perhaps even grappling to recapture the feelings of better times for his own sake just as much as from a desire to appease the Lightners present. Susie being the outsider here positions her in a fascinating spot too, not being a part of this family and implied to have a rather fraught family life herself. We know that she used to harbor a deep grudge against Chris and that she's noticed how good of a mother Toriel has been for them. With how far she's already come and how swiftly Toriel has connected with her, we have all this palpable potential to explore what Susie lacks and perhaps provide even further temptations to her if Tenna does take that approach in his role as antagonist. If nothing else, I do think Toriel's locked room may be explored in greater depth, not just due to the chocolates, but anything else she may be hiding from her child. Even as someone as warm and kind as Toriel has secrets, and this may provide an opportunity for her evasiveness toward the family's problems to finally be put to the test. Maybe we'll even get more information on the past with the holidays. Something as simple as old home movies made manifest, or other trinkets and mementos reborn as Darkners. There isn't a lot connecting the holidays to this chapter in the preview materials, but I do think it's worth noting that the unused sneaking music did feature the Lost Girl motif. The sneaking mechanic in the track were dropped, but given how deliberately Toby uses leitmotifs most of the time, there's a possibility that there's some secret related to the holidays and the Dreemurrs that is, or at least was, planned. It's too early to say, and we also have to factor in the likely appearances of Undyne, Napstablook, or both. But I think the family will be a pivotal point in Chapter 3, given the preview image of Chapter 4's Lightworld segment, where Susie mentions how weird Chris's family is. As for Chapter 4 itself, we know very little about it, but the recent newsletter did give us a tease with Noelle holding up a flashlight in a dark area with Christmas decor. This suggests a return to Noelle as a focal point in at least some capacity, but then there's the floral imagery that started featuring in Summer 2024's newsletter, which coincidentally also gave us more updates on Chapter 4's progress. We'll touch more on the flower aspect in that newsletter and what I think it might mean in a moment, but if the chapter focuses more on Noelle, I don't think we can rule out Ices in some capacity. After all, she's been established to have a history with the character ever since childhood, given more depth in the Spamton sweepstakes, but also touched on in other places, such as her Is Icy a Real Cryptid search in Chapter 2. There's also the ominous note that Chapter 2 left us with Rudy, who said he'd be at church tomorrow, opening up the possibility for new developments on Rudy and his ultimate fate. If we do get a Flower King in Chapter 4, there's also room to explore Rudy and Asgore's bond in that capacity. I can even see a really dark turn of events where the holidays go to Asgore's shop to get flowers for the funeral, only for there to be a surprise Dark World and a focus on shared grief. Though again, we're working with very limited pieces of information right now, and it still seems a bit early for Rudy to suddenly die. Regardless, I do think that returning to Noelle after a chapter focused on the Dreemurrs is a really smart choice, given the connecting thread the two families share as one of the keystones of Deltarune's narrative. It wouldn't surprise me if we see more repercussions from the Weird Route here too, especially when Noelle was planning to find out what's wrong with Chris in that route, not to mention Birdley's whole situation. And either way, I do think Rudy's illness and possible death has been set up as a significant plot point. If he dies, Noelle will have to deal with another grave loss, as will her mother, when death's already left a gaping hole in the family. However, Rudy living would subvert expectations in interesting ways, assuming his survival is earned. There's also the interesting angle of taking him into a Dark World to save him as well, with room for a bittersweet outcome where he has to stay in the Dark World or he truly will die. As for Azrael, I think the big question is how much he'll have changed since college. I don't think it's a coincidence that the game is front-loaded with all these memories of Azrael as this golden boy, even beginning with Toriel questioning if he'll enjoy hometown after his time away. It would be very like Toby Fox to give us a present-day Azrael who has changed since he's had time away from his simple life and overprotective mother. Imagine if Azrael appears with the unused boy band hair from Undertale, decked out in punk attire. I think it'd make for a hilarious contrast to say the least. Also, given the bromance between Pizza Pants and Azrael, I think it'd be freaking hilarious if Toby ship-teased the two. Do I expect it to happen? No. But it would be a riot. But for now, that's all I can really glean with the two families from the pieces so far. So let's have a little more fun with some weaker but still interesting possibilities, starting with... As I mentioned, flowers featured heavily in the summer mini-newsletter, alongside images of Papyrus and Asgore. On one hand, this could simply be due to the flowers and summer going hand in hand, along with the continued Papyrus Q&A. On the other hand, Asgore had been largely missing from the newsletters prior to that point, only to get a lot of screen time this time, along with the colored flowers from his shop in Deltarune. Given what little we know, I think Flower King is a strong contender for Chapter 4's Dark World. Taken on its own, that wouldn't be all that strange, but there were a few other details that stood out to me, such as the inclusion of Ralsei's Chapter 1 design, and a little flower sprouting from his hat. To be honest, I don't want to read too deeply into this, but the fact that we see Ralsei in this form suggests to me that he may put his hat back on, perhaps out of shyness. Maybe an interaction with Toriel in Chapter 3 makes him feel insecure about his appearance and how similar he looks to her and Azrael. With Ralsei's questions of identity that we see in Chapter 2, he may be in the middle of an existential crisis, causing him to lose some of the confidence he's gained before. After all, he's still trying to figure out what being Ralsei-like means. Seeing a Lightner who looks so much like him and then another in Asgore might be enough to leave him questioning himself to a greater degree. There's also an existing precedent associating him with flowers. On Toby's Twitter, he quote-retweeted the official Ralsei shirt with the following: "Ralsei shirt! He's always getting mixed up with flowers, isn't he?" That hasn't happened. Given how much Toby has planned in advance, this could well be foreshadowing for some Flower and Ralsei connection, or even a Flowey and Ralsei connection, with how recurring Flowey was in the newsletter. Plus, when you add in Ralsei's role as the game's tutorial character, and his great degree of meta-knowledge not only in that tutorial, but throughout the game, it places him in parallel with Flowey, albeit in a more benevolent sense. It would not surprise me at all if Toby explored these parallels further. As for Asgore and the flower shop itself, I think there are some potentially interesting angles to draw from. The Darkness would likely be based on the various plants and objects in the shop, such as Asgore's superhero comics. I could also see this Dark World representing Asgore's desires to reclaim the lost love and family, with the wedding photo and the flowers from the wedding bouquet manifesting as Darkness, and perhaps wanting Asgore to escape the hardships of his real life in favor of a more idyllic world where he's loved. The lesson he may face is that he needs to let go of the past and accept that times change, but he can still work toward happiness. Between Chapter 3 and 4, this would tie into Susie's dialogue we see at QC's in the teaser from the 2022 status update, where she comments on how weird Chris's family is. The problem is, this still doesn't fit Noelle in, hence my earlier proposal that Rudy's fate brings her into the fold. If not Rudy's death, it's possible that she approaches Asgore for some other reason, perhaps to buy flowers for her mother to break the ice between them, or some other errand on Rudy's behalf. I do think Noelle's presence would add something to the scenario, if only because Noelle would remember the family's happier days and Asgore's time pre-divorce, something Susie lacks. On the other hand, it's entirely possible that Toby has something else planned, and I spent way too much time ruminating on cute sprite gifs in the newsletter. With that being said, the recent newsletter has brought Papyrus Knight theory crafting back to the forefront of the discussion. There are a few things that stick out to me in the newsletter specifically in that regard. First, we see all this imagery of Papyrus watering the flowers, including flowers that came from Asgore's shop. If Papyrus is the Roaring Knight, this could allude to that fact, as by making a dark fountain there, he'd be giving those flowers new life and, in a way, tending to them in a manner of speaking. But another thing that stood out to me was the Q&A question about the circus. In it, Papyrus shows a familiarity with circuses, which, while on one hand this could be a reference to the unused circus imagery in the Undertale art book, he also makes a reference to being trapped in a cage, which could tie into Jebel, as well as the banished kings, who were locked in cages when Spade King rose to power. In Undertale, Papyrus mentions a trashy who lives in the trash, and Bone Trousel was apparently the original battle theme for the game that would eventually become Deltarune. That, combined with Papyrus's conspicuous absence being described as busy on the Steam page, does at least lend itself to the idea of Papyrus the Knight, though the question of motivation comes to play. It really depends on what the Roaring Knight's goal is, whether they are a malicious force or using the Dark Worlds to impart some sort of lesson and personal growth. The Roaring Knight could be acting for some noble goal, perhaps even to facilitate a role in the prophecy. If Papyrus is the Knight, it could be that he is someone who thrives on escapism due to his lack of friends in the new town, or other personal issues that can make him less outwardly bombastic than the skeleton we see in Undertale. Perhaps he could even have an arc where he becomes more like the Papyrus we do see in that game. If the Skelebros from Deltarune timeline theory turns out to be true, this could factor into it somehow. For more on that theory, you can check out the playlist linked above and in the description. Editing Dorked here with a quick addendum. I'd also be remiss not to briefly mention the connections people have made to Papyrus and the man behind the tree, due to the garden-themed Undertale merch showing Papyrus behind a tree with red leaves. This is a possible tease, but I'm hesitant to treat it as proof, even if the Ralsei flower shirt could potentially serve as foreshadowing too. But right now, this is still a fair bit of a reach. I just thought it warranted a brief mention, since we have a great deal of Papyrus focus in the recent newsletters, which suggests that, if nothing else, Toby does have some plans in store for him. It isn't lost on me that Shaw warned of the dangers of visiting Castletown after dark at the end of Chapter 2. Given that Chapter 2 ended with Chris opening a dark fountain at night, it's possible that we may see the repercussions of this in play, even if it's in Chapter 3's Dark World. Right now we know too little to say with confidence. Most of the pre-release images of Chapter 3's Dark World present a very vibrant, lively, and colorful world between the Shadow Men, the Weather Duo, the possibly unused cowboy area, and the Green Room itself. The one exception was the recent preview image from the latest newsletter, which presents the chapter's starting area as a dark and ominous place with a bridge, not unlike the cliffs in Chapter 1. However, based on the currently available information, I suspect that this area will soon give way to the livelier aesthetics that are likely to make up the majority of the chapter. Granted, there is room for a twist later on, or even in Castletown. Depending on when they return to reality, it's possible that Chris and Susie could have to carry the objects into the closet, Toriel facilitating it, assuming she's in on the situation. It's about the only seamless way I could see them doing it, but then it does beg the question of whether or not Toriel really would be okay with them bringing so many items from her house into the school. It is possible, too, that Chris and Susie will just use the wagon and a blanket to cover up all the objects and claim it's part of their project. On the positive side, Toriel's awareness would help her better understand what Chris and Susie are getting into, prevent any awkward complications later, and even facilitate Chris and Toriel being more genuine with each other. Well, as genuine as Chris can be under our control. We also have to consider the police involvement here. Chapters 1 and 2 tease at Undyne wanting something exciting to happen in the town, but laughing off Chris's warnings about the Dark Worlds. I mentioned in a much older video how part of the reason Chris may have slashed the tires and set up a scare was to force Undyne to take them seriously. In the Chapter 4 town images, we see the police station is closed. It's possible that after the events of Chapter 3, Undyne is too exhausted to come into work that day. The same could apply to Napstablook if they end up in the Dark World. There's also a possibly darker implication if it turns out that Chapter 3 has its own weird route with a dark fate for Undyne. I'm hesitant to speak with certainty there, as I'd like to think the weird route sequence-breaking and creepypasta vibes would lead into more creative applications in later chapters. It also really depends on how Toriel and the cops factor into the progression. As for other aspects of Chapter 3, we have Tenna and Mike as named characters. Given Spamton's comments during the Q&A of the Spamton sweepstakes, we can conclude the TV he ranted about in his shop was in fact Tenna and not Mike, with Spamton and Mike having a more cordial and positive bond. Further are hinted at on the Damn You Tenna page from the sweepstakes. My current guess is that Tenna is the main authority here, with the Shadow Men as his mooks, but it's possible that Mike will play a role as well. He might even usurp Tenna and become the area's final story boss, perhaps out of resentment if he ends up being a radio and feeling obsolete compared to the TV. He's also a secret boss contender, but what I find noteworthy is how the fight paths for both Jevil and Spamton Neo foreshadow a future plot character, in Queen and Mike respectively. If it's meant to spotlight the area's main boss, then Mike usurping Tenna gains even more likelihood. We really don't have much to go off of in terms of the chapter structure, save for Toby stating that it wasn't your standard chapter, whereas Chapter 4 would be more conventional. Given its appearance in the Spamton sweepstakes, it's possible that the coat on the chair and the notion of going darker than dark will at least be introduced or alluded to here, but it's just as possible that this was more of a long-term tease. We already got a bit of a hint at Birdley wanting to open a dark fountain at the end of Chapter 2, as well as Queen's goal to create a Neo-Dark fountain, which Ralsei strongly objected to for fear of the roaring. This certainly feels like planting for later, though how much later is up for debate. What's interesting is that Chapter 4's town segment takes place during the morning, rather than in the late afternoon like previous chapters, at least Alfie stating that there's no school that day, and that opens up a lot of fun possibilities for NPC interactions and side activities, such as finally hanging out with Metatron and maybe some tangible Papyrus appearances. Plus, we still gotta hang out with Onion again, whose talk of the mysterious Song of the Sea is most certainly leading to something. Of course, Deltarune also has its meta-narrative to consider. Chapter 1 set the foundation, the Goner Maker sequence, and the second voice discarding our vessel. Then there's the 3 separate files in Chapter 1, which each have a different bit of flavor text for Asriel's drawer, suggesting some differentiation for each individual playthrough. Molly Stars goes into much greater detail about this and other notable meta aspects of Deltarune in her excellent Device Theory series, which I'll link in the description. Nonetheless, it's extremely apparent that the relationship between the consumers of stories and games and the media we consume will be a central point in Deltarune, explored most thoroughly through our relationship with Chris as a player vessel with their own life and personality that predates our involvement in the game. Moreover, the relationship we have with the game and its characters directly mirrors the relationship the characters have with Dark Worlds, deepening the core themes. What I find interesting is the subtle progression. In Chapter 1, Chris's actions and core personality are much more subtle. You can get early tastes of it by repeatedly flushing the toilet, or by inferring from the environmental storytelling, or how others react to them. But while the Chapter 1 hometown segment starts to plant seeds for Chris's greater personality, interests, hobbies, and relationships, Chapter 2 Chris is much more emotive, and reacts far more explicitly to our choices. The tone they deliver the dialogue we choose, the ways they might act contrary to what we choose, such as the choice at the end of Spamton Neo's fight showing distress even if you say you're okay, or their confusion if you choose anyone but Susie for the festival, Chris's disappointed flop when they can't reach the arcade controls, the way their toast act to Queen shows that they genuinely enjoyed being truces with her. You just get a lot more sense of how Chris feels during this Dark World adventure. Whereas the examples in Chapter 1 were deceptively subtle, no doubt to lull players into thinking Chris was just an ordinary self-insert protagonist rather than a deconstruction. With that in mind, I think there's room for this idea to further develop in the next 2 chapters. Perhaps the further we play, the more Chris will assert themselves through their actions and behaviors. The balance of player to vessel may shift depending on the route. After all, the weird route more or less requires us to force Chris to act in a horrible way, making Noelle actively freeze darkness to death, proceed through uncomfortable situations with little kindness or compassion, and effectively force the ideals of a heteronormative and toxic relationship on 2 friends without romantic feelings, right down to the wedding ring iconography. Chris calls for their friends, showing that they are still there, and they refuse to let us see what Noelle is up to when Ralsei tries to shift the perspective. On the other hand, our control is made so much more explicit in this route, especially in the hospital scene, where Noelle herself comments on it. Meanwhile, Susie represents someone who goes from being distant and viewing darkness as enemies to overcome, to growing truly attached and immersed in the Dark Worlds, to a point where she even questions if the Knight's objectives are truly so bad, and hopes to bring her Darkner friends into reality. This happens regardless of player input as a natural part of her arc, though I think in the case of the Weird Route, she'll take on the role of an eventual boss and grow more and more worried and suspicious of Chris, as she already picks up on their strange reactions once the group reunites after the Birdley encounter. I mentioned this in my Weird Route video, but it's worth noting that Chapter 2's route only begins once Susie leaves the party, so we should consider the possibility that her leaving the party in future chapters will open up opportunities for similar routing. Susie is a very independent character who is not so easily pushed around, whereas Noelle being so meek made her easier to manipulate. Ralsei, I think, sits in a place where he may raise protests, but he's also so eager to please the player that he may be more complicit than Susie. As for Birdley, we have not only his presumed death in the Weird Route, but also the branch of the Standard Route to consider, where he burns his wing and is paralyzed in reality. One could argue this is another form of immersion in the fantastical affecting reality, and it'd be interesting to see future examples of this and the consequences therein. On an even deeper level, I believe the Weird Route might be symbolic of rebellion against the idea of a single route or ending, where players will look for any excuse to break the game's intended progression to see something new, to prove this is more than what it seems, and rebel against immersing oneself in a linear story Toby set out to tell, but making others make story-breaking choices for you. Which brings us to the question of whether or not choices don't matter is meant to be taken literally, or subverted like kill or be killed in Undertale. Personally, I suspect it's more of the latter, given that the Weird Route exists, the Thrash Machine made its return, and choices like whether or not we hang out with Onion or recruit Darkners will influence aspects of the game. I think the mere fact that Castletown develops as we recruit more Darkners lends itself to some plot development. Not only do we as a player gain more facilities and charming character interactions, but Ralsei's once lonely kingdom becomes something more. When you factor in the town being named after the player and Ralsei's meta-knowledge, plus the Great Door still existing, this little slice of the Dark World still has many lingering mysteries, and how we progress through the game may in turn influence the shape this kingdom takes for better or worse. I fully expect the cliffs to come back in some way or form, considering the areas we didn't get to explore. Even in the event that the ending itself never changes, or only has subtle branches, I do think choices can still matter in terms of the overall journey. The tricky part about predicting where Deltarune will go is that there are so many possibilities for interesting Dark World locations, but as far as we know, only 7 chapters to explore these concepts. We know that Chapter 3 is going to heavily feature a television motif, take place in the Dreemurr house, and likely feature Toriel and Undyne in some meaningful fashion. If Flower King does end up taking the Chapter 4 slot, then that gives a consistent Dreemurr-focused through-line that could lead into a possible Asriel arrival in Chapter 5. But since the subsequent newsletter placed Noelle in the focus, we could just as easily pivot over to the holidays and explore an entirely different Dark World setting. I suspect we'll see the festival in Chapter 5, as it's been built up throughout the game, and especially in Chapter 2. When you consider that originally Toby had planned to release Chapters 3 through 5 as a bundle, a festival seems like a good spot for a major turning point in the story. Plus, the balloon image shown in the anniversary newsletter does lend itself to the possibility. The question is, what does this mean for the Dark Worlds? There are still so many locations that would make fantastic settings. The church, the hospital, ICs, the mayor's office. The trouble is, there's only so much room in terms of narrative and progression, and I personally suspect that Chapter 6 is going to be the bunker, as the number 6 is heavily associated with Gaster. The bunker makes the Muse smile noise, and I personally suspect that Chapter 7 will focus on the roaring and banishing the Angel's Heaven. One possibility is that something derails the festival, such as Rudy's death or him entering a critical state that causes Noelle to open a dark fountain to try and save him. Or, if a funeral service happens, the dark fountain could form in the church. There's also the possibility that the church is where the final battle or area takes place due to the heavy connection to the angel and the town's local religion. But there's just too much with ICs going on for it not to lead to something. This becomes especially apparent when you look back at the Spamton sweepstakes, and especially the IC sighting page, where it's outright stated that Des also submitted her own findings, even if we never get to see them. With this in mind, an IC's Dark World would be another excellent opportunity to learn more about Des, and it's another point in favor of Chapter 4 focusing on it rather than Flower King. Then again, the balloon could also relate to birthday parties, which are common in pizza parlors, thus placing Chapter 5 as another possibility. It feels like way too big of an opportunity to not tap into some genuine horror, not only due to the two families' pasts with the Icy character, but the nightmare puzzle in Undertale, the grotesque feeling of characters like the Warrior, and the general uncanniness associated with pizza parlors in pop culture, which already led to the popular Five Nights at Freddy's series. Add that to Noelle being so tied up in glitch hunting and creepypastas, and I honestly believe it has way too much potential. Though there's also the holiday residence as another possibility for a future chapter. I'm a bit wary of introducing too many Dark World candidates when there are already so many options made possible simply by the presence of double doors. If you stick strictly to these as a design motif, then our options are Icy's, the hospital, the double doors in Asgore's shop, the church, the bunker, and possibly the holiday residence. The Dreemurr house proves this isn't a required feature, but if Chris isn't the knight, that could also be seen as another clue that their fountain differs from the knight's movements. The problem here is that all the options I listed hold some significance to major and recurring characters. The hospital obviously ties to Rudy, but the church is tied to the town's religion, and with Rudy hoping to attend, that could theoretically narrow it down, but that would also shift the church to Chapter 4 over the more obvious Ices or Flower King. We have so many puzzle pieces at this time, but assembling them is the tricky part, made more complicated by the number of mysteries dangling over our heads, plus the festival as a big event. But maybe that's the key. Maybe the festival leads to the roaring, after some lighthearted fun with the majority of the cast present. It would lead to an extremely climactic setup, and could potentially even cause the gang to seek out the bunker in a desperate bid to take shelter from the chaos and pursue the truth behind everything. If we take it from this angle, the festival occurring at the end of Chapter 5 or 6 might be even more appropriate, or Chapter 7 if it ends up being a longer chapter, perhaps even as a false celebration before things take a darker turn. So I suppose it's a question of narrowing down the selection, or perhaps there could be multiple locations explored in Dark Worlds as we get deeper into the game. There's also the question of which characters will factor into the plot progression too. We have several lingering plot threads including the beef between Susie and Caddy, the disappearance of Des, how Asgore lost his job, Asriel and Chris and their complicated relationship, Jockington. He's got his own fan club and his own magazines. It feels like something is building. Icy is clearly significant if the Spampton sweepstakes is any indication, and has ties to the childhoods of the Dreemurr and Holiday kids. The Song of the Sea that Onion Song heard. Whether or not the vessel will become relevant. The nature of the Angel. Susie's home life. Castletown's growth and what it might mean. Why we're controlling Chris. Hanging out with Mettaton. Alfie's and Undyne's relationship, Gerson's legacy, the Skeleton Brothers, Sham, the Super Bosses and the Shadow Crystals, Gaster, obviously, the Roaring Knight's identity, and Ralsei's true nature and objectives. And these are just a few examples. When you factor in the mysterious nature of the Weird Route, there are so many ways things could go. The problem with working from meager scraps is that the plot could go in so many directions, and so many swerves could totally take us off guard. Still, with the limited pieces we have, I think some plot threads will be more significant to the main story, and others will be more background lore and side quests. Activities like hanging out with Onion Song may provide additional lore and rewards through seeking them out, that recontextualize later story events and give them more meaning, or otherwise expand the plot. I very much suspect the eggs will serve this purpose, being not too important but not too unimportant. Dragon Blazers comes up so often, it feels like a plausible place to consider future plot beats. We know from Chapter 2 that the sister in Dragon Blazers 2 returns to the party, but weaker than before. This could suggest that Des will be a late-game party member, but changed, or that someone else will suffer a power loss due to story events. I would say it's worth keeping an eye on future Dragon Blazers references as more chapters release, especially given the added material from the sweepstakes, with the Ice Palace and Noelle's glitch hunting tying into the uncanny feeling of the Weird Route. Where the Angel is concerned, there's been a lot of discussion about whether Noelle is the Angel or the player, but who's to say it can't be both? Much like how the Angel in Undertale changes its meaning depending on the route, it could be that Noelle represents the Angel from the in-universe narrative, but the player is the Angel on a meta-narrative level. It isn't lost on me that even Spampton refers to Noelle as an angel, in the route where we use her as a puppet to break the story. And with Des also being so significant in her absence, that further adds to Noelle's importance and symbolism as an angelic figure, if nothing else. When it comes to piecing together the core story focus, I'd say that Gonermaker can give us clues by way of which characters it considers very, very wonderful. That is to say, Chris, Susie, and Noelle. Not to say the other classmates don't matter. Caddy herself has ties to both Chris and Noelle through the occult, and she and Jockington are a package deal. But I have a hunch that other NPCs like Caddy with a Y, Bratty, Pizza Pants, and the Ghost Cousins will lead to more side activities and world building, rather than being major players in the game's central story. However, I don't see Monster Kid, Snowy, or Temmie being as vital to the main narrative at this current time. That could change, but I think it's likely they'll remain supporting characters rather than key players. Meanwhile, Alfie sits in an interesting place where Deltarune's exploration of escapism, coupled with her living in Gerson's shadow, makes her a prime candidate to appear in a future Dark World. Her closeness with Asgore might even warrant her appearing in Flower King, for instance, and we can already expect Undyne to appear in Chapter 3. The Skeleton Brothers also have a strong likelihood of factoring into the larger story, even if Papyrus isn't the Roaring Knight, by virtue of Sans' connections to Gaster and Undertale, and Gaster's fingerprints being all over this entire game. Add that to Sans and Toriel being such close friends, and Asgore going to him for pickles and advice, and if nothing else, they'll probably factor into the Dreemurr conflict in some way or form. While I touched on Knight Papyrus and Alvin earlier, I'd be remiss to not at least mention some of the other popular guesses I've seen. First, we have the Vessel, who I think would be really cool in the context of engineering your own enemy. It'd give some fascinating payoff to the Vessel, and I could see it carrying some resentment for its fate, being cast aside just like the Darkness. Moreover, it adds to the lack of choice in a poignant way. We didn't choose to abandon it, just as we didn't choose to inhabit Chris's body. My main reservation is that it would require so many sprite variations outside of a generic knight design to account for all the possible combinations for the Vessel. The Thrash Machine differs in that it was used in a very specific context, both in the rules fight and the battle against Giga Queen, where only the headpiece really mattered. Next, we have Des and Mayor Holiday. I touched on the Mayor Holiday Knight theory a bit on my video on her, but what I find so fascinating and compelling about both these candidates is how deeply rooted they are in the central story of Deltarune. It'd be elegant, especially if the mayor ended up opening Darkworld specifically to find her daughter, or perhaps to even save her husband. It'd tie well to a sympathetic angle of her suffering from grief and grappling to take control in a cruel world, fitting with how heavily she asserts control over the town. As for Des, it would lend itself to a really depressing reveal. Des returning, but either not being fully herself anymore after her experiences, or otherwise changing in some meaningful fashion or rebelling. My main reservation with Knight Des is that if she's the voice lost in the game's code, that would potentially conflict with her moving about the light world and opening fountains. But I've seen other options thrown around. Alphys would be fascinating, if only because I can see it in the sense that she already has escapist tendencies, immerses herself in fiction, and has deep personal struggles that I think could lend to her opening these fountains through imaginary worlds, made more interesting due to her connections to determination in Undertale. I've seen Mad Mew Mew's ghost form thrown around, along with Asgore and even Asriel. These I'm not as convinced by, but I'm sure Toby could pull it off. There's even the possibility that we've been looking at the Roaring Knight the wrong way, and their identity isn't meant to be a mystery we solve with the existing cast, but is an entirely new character. Or Gaster, I guess, acting as both a threat to overcome and the guiding force on our journey, like a dungeon master in a tabletop campaign, orchestrating the entire quest by giving us a reason to move forward. And while we're on the subject of Gaster, I don't think he'll be an evil or malicious character simply because he wants to create a new future with us, suggesting that he wants to avert the catastrophe of the Roaring. It's possible that his interactions with the secret bosses were done in good faith, and he underestimated how deeply his knowledge would scar their worldviews. My guess is that we won't see him in person until late into the game, perhaps in a bunker chapter, where everything finally comes together. The "what do you two think" quote might even be referring to Chris and Des in the past, or Chris and Susie in the present, recontextualizing the entirety of entry number 17. He may or may not be a boss, though I could see him taking a boss role in the weird route, given his ties to Deltarune's meta-narrative being so upfront that he's the one providing us with the game and the initial save system with the hopes of a new future. Us going so off-script may go against his wishes, and coax him to take a stand, though I am admittedly more partial to the Weird Route Showdown being either Susie or Chris themselves. As one final Gaster-related note, I do believe that he may be the origin of Ralsei, not only due to the prophecy being whispered across time and space, but if Chris had lost the Red Horn headband in the bunker, and the bunker is where Gaster conducted his experiments, then it stands to reason that Ralsei could have resulted from those early experiments, and also would explain why Ralsei's fountain is so different from the others. With regards to the secret bosses and shadow crystals, I believe Ralsei will connect to them in some capacity, perhaps even being a shadow crystal holder himself. He's already established as an anomaly among Darkners. The sheer scope of his meta-knowledge, his ability to recognize the school in the light world, Chris's room, and the fact that he can go to all other Dark Worlds without penalty. Since Spamton and Jevil also possess a great deal of knowledge that eclipses other Darkners, Ralsei would fit right in. Queen does fit a similar niche with her awareness of the library, but I suspect a lot of her knowledge comes from a combination of her being a computer, as well as her position of power as the area's ruler and main story boss. This pales in comparison to Ralsei's deep awareness of not only the layout of the school, but his ability to sense when the library Dark Fountain formed that afternoon, and teleport there to join his friends. It's quite a step above Jigsaw Joe, Lancer, and the other Darkners that occasionally comment on the gameplay mechanics to a lesser capacity. But it also wouldn't surprise me if Shama ended up having one and getting a proper battle later, as they already have so much knowledge of the crystals and items like the Shadow Mantle. Speaking of the Shadow Mantle, we know it's significant to the next chapter's secret boss, but went missing. I'm still of the belief that Ralsei may have it on hand, but I've also seen it speculated that it's the cape that King discarded before his fight. It may also be an item we discover as part of a secret boss quest, like the disc for Spamton. Still, Ralsei's level of meta-knowledge remains suspicious enough that, if Gaster was involved in his creation, then it only makes sense that he would hold a Shadow Crystal. Regardless, the Shadow Crystals have an unsettling feeling, with the way they changed in the Light World, showing what seems like a parallel world, and an unpleasant one at that. We'll have to see how this pattern continues with future secret bosses, and what else the Shards of Glass reveal. As for Ralsei's motivations in relation to Chris and the player, I actually did a video a while back on that very subject, if you'd like to hear my thoughts on the subject in more depth. In the end, though, these are all just guesses working from only a small handful of puzzle pieces. I still remember how before Chapter 2, nobody really anticipated that the computer lab would be the next Dark World. We may have more ideas with where the future chapters could go, but I would advise everyone to not get too married to any one fan idea. There's great fun to be had in conceptualizing theories for future chapters, but Toby has had a plan for this story for a very long time, and I for one am excited to see what he has in store. Time will tell how much bearing the newsletters have on the shape of Deltarune, and how the full experience of the next 2 chapters changes our outlook on the game as a whole. If I had one piece of advice to everyone, be they fellow analysts and theorists or other creators and fans, it's to keep an open mind and not to get hung up on any one idea. Sometimes it feels like there's this need to win at theory crafting, but none of us are Toby Fox, and if we get too caught up on being right, we lose sight of the fun in speculating and sharing ideas within the community. So let's see where the road leads. I can't wait to see how the discussions shift after the next release, and what new ideas and conclusions people draw, and I'm certainly going to make videos on the new material when the time comes. Feel free to share your own speculation in the comments, though, and if you'd like to stay up to date on my future projects, go ahead and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. In the meantime, I have a lot of other video topics planned for Undertale and Deltarune, as well as other games like the Persona series. I still want to find the right balance, as I don't want to alienate my core audience, so I'll probably put out non-Undertale Deltarune videos more sporadically, since they don't tend to perform quite as well. That being said, if you like video game music and leitmotifs, I have a playlist with 2 videos I've done covering many games and their uses of leitmotifs, both for storytelling purposes and in more subtle ways. I've also made a short video on one of Toby's biggest inspirations, Moon Remix RPG Adventure. I keep talking about the big Goro Akechi analysis I have planned, which I hope to make a reality in 2025, but in order to do the topic justice, I am to revisit Persona 5 Royal as well as side materials like Persona Q2, the Mementos Mission manga, and revisit the Repaint Your Heart DLC in order to give the most comprehensive view possible. He's a character who means a lot to me, so it's more of a passion project. However, if you want to stay up to date on that in future videos, please consider joining my Patreon, where you can get updates, early script access, and access to other creative works like concept art and music scratch tracks for Inverted Fate and other projects. I have no idea how long this video ended up, but I hope you enjoyed. Till next time, stay awesome.